One of the questions today that probably comes up as much as any, and one of the more provocative questions today is, when does life begin? How many have heard that question? When does life begin in the womb? What is the question we're really asking? Not when does life begin in the womb, but I submit that we should ask, when does a person begin in the womb? This little fetus is in its seventh week of development. Technically, some would call it an embryo at this stage. The embryo magically becomes known as a fetus at about 8 weeks, maybe a week after this picture. And that change from embryo to fetus really is a change that says the basic work has been done. So 7, 8 weeks into pregnancy, it's pretty well, as far as making the fundamental organs of the body, the basic architecture, the work is completed. Not really completed, but the parts are there. When we leave that embryo stage and we go to the stage we call the fetus, we're really talking about maturation or maturing of the parts. Well, the story begins very early when we address the question of when does a person begin, and I think the only way we can really address this question is to look at the Word of God itself. In Psalm 139, verse 13 and 14, we see where I found the title for this lecture. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I love that knitting. That word knitting and weaving appears quite often in the Bible. In fact, my field of expertise, the section that I did for the medical dictionary, and the area in which I was considered to be somewhat expert, is an area called histology. And histos is a Greek word which basically means fabric or tissue or knitting. So you might say I was an expert on knitting. When the early microscopists began to look at the body, magnify things, they thought, my goodness, it's woven. Everywhere we look, we see weaving. Our skin is made of collagen fibers, which are very, very tough. They're so strong, they're stronger than steel for the same cross-sectional diameter. They're less elastic than steel, and yet, look at this, it's stretchy. How is that possible? It's possible because of the knitting, because of the weaving. It's the way they're woven together. You weave one way, and it's not stretchy. That's the kind of architecture we have in the eyeball, so that it doesn't change shape. You weave another way, it's more like a double knit suit. It can be stretchy. So indeed, we are knit. We are woven, and the Lord knows that. He says we were knit together in our mother's womb. And the psalmist says, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Boy, if I were to ever do a modern translation of the Bible, I won't, so don't worry about it. But if I were to do a really modern translation of this verse, here's the way it would read. And folks would know exactly what it says then. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and that's like a no-brainer. Isn't that what the Bible's telling us? We know it full well. It is so obvious that when we go before the judgment throne of God, there won't be an excuse from anybody. You've had all the evidence you need. That's why I don't even attempt to prove or argue that there's design or intelligent design. Of course it's there. Let's just revel and enjoy some of the things that God has wrought here. Well, when do we become a person? First of all, the Lord recognizes as a person, and I would define a person in terms of God at least, as a person who is known to God. Someone with a soul. Wouldn't that be a good definition, at least for a Christian, for a person, somebody known to God? Can you imagine a person that is not known by God, whose soul is not known by God? There we get into things that are sort of out of our realm. In Psalm 139, it says, my frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. That's kind of a name for the womb. I can't really quite get at it. Something's going on in there. When I was woven, oh, we're back to weaving again. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, a kind of another euphemism for the womb, your eyes, that is God's eyes, saw my unformed body. Man alive, that settles it right there. That settles the abortion issue. God is looking on. As the baby is developing in the womb, God is checking it out. Your eyes saw my unformed body. That means when we abort a baby developing in the womb, I believe we're going right before the eyes of God and removing. That's not something we ought to do. Oh, and then we get into something I don't even want to think about. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. What that suggests to me is that our personhood to God was known even before the worlds were formed. And that's not something we can act on. That's a matter that God can deal with. He's just told us that he knows us that well, but that's not something we can act on. When we try to figure out what a person is, we're going to have to go by something that we can see and understand. And so we're going to look into the womb now and see what goes on, starting from as early as we can start in the fertilization process. And before we do that, we need to read Ecclesiastes. You know, when I was a professor active in the university, it's awfully easy to get the big head, you know. In this big university, you have all these wonderful students, and I think every professor who's a Christian at least, and I would urge the others to do it too, ought to read the book of Ecclesiastes at least once a year. It just kind of lets the air out of the bag, out of the wind bag. Down it goes. And before I would give a lecture on embryology or how the bones would develop, I would always like to think of this verse. As you do not know the path of the wind or how the body is formed in the mother's womb, so you cannot understand the works of God, the maker of all things. What a way to start out. We're basically told, well, you can take a look, but you're still not going to understand. We'll understand something. We'll learn something maybe we didn't know before, but we're not going to hit the bottom on this one. You'll see that as we go along. So with that kickoff, let's just look at that secret place. This is the womb. It sets low in the pelvis, down between the hips down there. As you can see in this picture, it's got like sort of little water wings that go out each side from the uterus, and they kind of hold it in place so it doesn't rock too far forward or back. And from the uterus, there's a couple of arms called the oviducts. You can see them up there labeled oviducts, which is just fancy for egg tube. And these oviducts are kind of like this. I think of Atlas carrying the earth on his back. You know, the uterus is the body, the arms go up, and the hands are the ends of the oviduct, and there's fingers on the hands, and there's fingers on the end of these oviducts, little finger-like processes. Where do the eggs come from? Well, the eggs come from an organ called an ovary, which basically means an organ that produces eggs. So you see it's all pretty simple once you get through the names. And the eggs are going to leave the ovary and enter the oviduct. And that already, as far as I'm concerned, we have a miracle on our hands. Every 28 days, normally, an egg will be released from the ovary. The egg will be released first from one ovary, then the next month, the other ovary, and it takes turns, left, right, left, right. They're courteous, they take turns. Now, if you remove one of the ovaries, or it becomes damaged so that it can't no longer produce the ova, the other ovary has the considerable good sense to just go right on ahead and produce an egg every month. We call that a compensatory response. And so anyway, the eggs are produced, and when they're produced, they're ejected out of the ovary when they reach just the right level. And when they're ejected out of the ovary, the trick is you need to catch it. And the oviduct, with its little fingers on the end, come right down on top of that ovary and kind of feel around and see where the egg is coming out. And then it parks there, and it catches the egg. Sort of like if the catcher were to walk out to the pitcher's mound, take his glove, put it over the pitcher's fist and say, all right, pitch it. I think I can get this one. Because you see, you better get it. If you miss and the egg doesn't go in the oviduct, it's out in the peritoneum. That's a space around all of our organs. It can implant there and start to develop. And that will become fatal for both mother and child. Call that an ectopic pregnancy. So it's very important that the oviduct catch the egg. Let's look at this in a little more detail. We'll look at one of the ovaries as a drawing. These are wonderful drawings from Frank Netter, without whom I don't think anybody would get through medical school. They look at these drawings and study them. Inside this ovary, we find the eggs, and they start out as developing follicles. You can see them up here. And when a baby girl is born, as soon as she comes out of the womb, she has approximately 400,000 eggs ready to go. And no more are made. The newborn baby girl has all the eggs she's ever going to have. 400,000, many of which will not form children. Isn't that just as well? 400,000. Even the Lord, who's told us to be fruitful and multiply, knows that that's way too many arrows in our quiver. So about every month, every 28 days, about 30 or 40 of these little oocytes, we call them, will start to develop. A little cohort, if you will start to become larger and will build up cells around the outside periphery of the egg. And it'll produce a kind of a cyst. It's a hollow ball with fluid inside. You can see them up there, here and here, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The egg is this part right here, this little round thing, and that egg will eventually be released through a little opening in the surface of the ovary. If the egg entering the oviduct is not fertilized, then a big change occurs. Because you see, after the egg is released, what's left of the follicle forms an endocrine organ called the corpus luteum, which means yellow body. But if we just called it yellow body, you wouldn't think it was all that complicated, so we give it the Latin name. And this yellow body, this corpus luteum, is an important endocrine system that will be necessary for the support and development of the baby should fertilization occur. But if fertilization doesn't occur, this endocrine thing that's left over from the follicle after the egg is released, it just starts breaking down. It gets a signal saying, you know, this egg never did get fertilized. I think you just ought to shut the whole plant down. And so what happens, it breaks down and forms a scar. Now here, you are going to see the hand of God pretty powerfully. The scar left behind from this corpus luteum, this endocrine tissue, is so large that you can take a microscope slide, hold it out at arm's length, and see the scar, never mind the microscope. And by the way, the whole ovary is about the size of an almond. Not the whole shell, just the nut part. So one whole ovary will fit on a typical microscope slide, and at arm's length you can see the scar. It's a big part of the ovary. And next month you're going to get another one of these scars. And next month you're going to get another scar, assuming fertilization doesn't occur. And next month yet another. Do you see a problem here? Any of you have scars? How long have you had them? I have a scar here I've had for, I think, 40 years. I'm sure I'll die with that scar there. You see, scar tissue just doesn't break down. Oh, we'd love to figure out a way. Plastic surgeons, if they could just make scars dissolve and go away, wouldn't that be wonderful? We can't do that. It's like a solid mass of connective tissue. It's pretty much with you for life. And every time you ovulate, you get another scar, and I would say 4 or 5 months. The ovary is nothing but scar tissue, and that means there can be no more life. Mammals do not exist. There are no people. It's pretty well over. I'll just open for questioning right now. We need a miracle right about now. We need to have one scar in our body that gets totally dissolved, and that's exactly what happens. This scar, which is called the white body, the corpus albicans, gets dissolved. Oh, would surgeons love to know how to do that and dissolve scars. Provident care of God, things we never even thought about that are going on, and I guess we just take for granted, don't we? Here's your basic game plan. The egg is going to have to go from here into the oviduct, which is not away like it is there, but right down on the surface. Fertilization is going to occur right about in here. And then if the egg is fertilized, the egg needs to move down the oviduct to the uterus where it'll implant and develop. Sperm cells, on the other hand, need to go the opposite direction. They need to go up the uterus and out into the oviduct. Things need to go two different directions at the same time. Egg needs to go down, the sperm needs to go out. You can say, well, I think I know how the sperm gets there. It's got a little tail, it wiggles the tail, the flagella, and that's not how it gets there. Sperm will get there even if the tails aren't active and movable. The musculature of the mother's uterus and oviduct actually moves the sperm up to the egg. And along the way, the sperm, by the way, is completely incapable of fertilizing that egg. That seems to be a problem right there, doesn't it? Except in the mother, there are chemicals that we say capacitate, make the sperm able to fertilize. So without capacitation, it'd be pretty much the end of life, at least mammals. The sperm arrives, the oviduct is coming down. How do we get the egg to go the opposite direction? If the muscles are bringing the sperm up, how does the egg go the other way? Because let's face it, if the egg just stayed in the oviduct, do you see a problem there? Fertilization could occur. The egg wouldn't go any further. It would implant in the oviduct. And sadly, that happens from time to time. It's called a tubal pregnancy. It's a medical emergency and will kill both mother and child unless something is done. That'd be the end of life right there. If you don't move the fertilized egg down the oviduct into the uterus, you don't have to even worry about what comes next in development, because that isn't going to happen anyway. And in the case of evolution, if you can't get the egg down the oviduct, you aren't ever going to get a second chance to get it down the oviduct because it's the end of that organism. Boy, talk about irreducible complexity. You know, I don't think bacteria necessarily need a flagellar motor because not all bacteria have a flagella. But if you can't produce offspring, that's irreducible. Let's see how that works. That little box, we're going to look at that part of the wall of the oviduct. There it is in the microscope. These are tall columnar cells, and up at the top, you see what look like little hairs up there? Those are called cilia. Each of those cells have thousands and thousands and thousands of little cilia. They're so tiny you can't even see one in the light microscope. You say, what do you mean? I'm seeing them up here. You're seeing them collectively. The way you can see hair, you can see that I have at least some hair, but you can't see one hair from where you are. And so these cilia are so small, even under the microscope, we can only see them collectively. Can't quite resolve one all by itself very easily, at least. And these cilia beat. And going down the oviduct, there are just trillions of these cilia. So how do they beat to move the egg? Well, we could say you just sort of fire the pistol and they all start beating. Well, imagine if all those trillions of cilia just started doing this. Would that move the egg down the oviduct? You maybe work up a little foam, that'd be it. I think I'm onto it. It's like window wipers on a car. They go like this, right? All of them together. Would that move the egg? No, the egg would sort of go forward, backward, forward, backward, forward. Oh my, you know what the movement is? It's a metachronal rhythm. Isn't that incredible? You say, what's a metachronal rhythm? Have you been to a ball game where they do the wave? That wave they get going in the stadium, that's a metachronal rhythm. Ever see wind blow across a wheat field, those waves that go through the wheat? That's a metachronal rhythm, and only that can move the egg in a coordinated way. Let me give you a little example of how these cilia beat. That is a metachronal rhythm. Can you think about this? Can your mind bend that far? Trillions of these, thousands per cell, all interacting collectively down the oviduct in concert, setting up an integrated metachronal rhythm without which the egg wouldn't go down the oviduct, without which there would be no peephole. No mammals. It'd be over. And don't say, hey, look, if you're evolution, we'll get it right next time. We're going to work on this. We'll come back. It's over. This is irreducible. This truly is irreducible. Well, let's look at the whole pattern of reproduction. The egg is released, and when it's first released, you have about a 12 to 24-hour period of time during which fertilization can occur. If it doesn't occur in that window, it's not going to occur. So sperm will be up in this region at the beginning of the oviduct. And if they're in this region at the time the egg is here, there is a good possibility that one of the sperm, at least, will manage to penetrate through and fertilize the egg. And if it does, the fertilized egg will move down the tube. It will go through its first cell division after being fertilized, and here at 30 hours we would have the first 2 cells. So what was 1 cell becomes 2. Let's look at this fertilization event a little closer. This is a cross-section of the oviduct, cut right across it, and inside, would you believe it, when I cut this section, I happened to hit the egg. To get the picture, you'd have to think of a basketball sort of floating in space someplace in a very long hallway. You make a random cut across the hallway, and you hit the basketball. And so that's what we managed to do. There it is, right in there. It was an incredible stroke of luck, some might say. And around that ball, you see the ball right in the middle, that's the egg, unfertilized. Around that ball is a bunch of messy-looking cells. See all the little blue dots there? They're just cells that accumulate around the egg. There's a very interesting scientific name, these cells. They're called the cells that accumulate around the egg. I'm not going too fast, am I? No. Would we call it the... No, it's the cumulus oophorus, which is the cells that accumulate around the egg. You think, do we need these things? Without these cells, you wouldn't be here. These cells, the cumulus, secrete a sticky stuff. And it's this sticky stuff that the cilia get a hold of to move the egg. They've done experiments where they've stripped these cells off and put an egg into the oviduct, say in rabbits. And the cilia just make the egg go round and round, sort of like a ball in the nose of a seal. You know how they can get it spinning? It doesn't go down the oviduct. Without the sticky goop made by the cumulus cells, it's pretty well over. You won't get a second chance to get it right. You need to get it right the first time. Now let's just magnify that egg cell with its investing cumulus cells. Here it is at higher power, and when we do this, inside of this big cell called the egg, you'll see there's a little blue dot here, and that little blue dot are the chromosomes, or represents the chromosomes of this egg cell. And you can see how much cytoplasm there is compared to the size of all of the chromosomes. And would you believe it? It's like making a section through a long hallway in which a basketball is in three-dimensional space. You not only hit the basketball, but inside the basketball is a little BB, and you hit the BB dead center. Would you mind if I just sort of stood here and gloated over this picture for a while? And those are the chromosomes, because when that egg is ovulated, it goes to form the first, what we call meiotic division. And it waits there with the chromosomes not pulled apart, but the spindle ready to pull them apart, and it won't go any further unless fertilization occurs. Then it'll go on. At 12 to 24 hours, we have fertilization. The fertilization process in itself is just incredible. There could be 100 or more sperm in the vicinity of the egg, and it's essential that only 1 sperm fertilize the egg. If you get 2 sperm in there, we call that polyspermy, and there's no possibility of getting a viable offspring here. It'll just spontaneously break down. The sperm cell has 3 barriers it has to get through to fertilize. First, it has to get through the cumulus. No way you're getting through the cumulus. I mean, you just can't get through. So that's pretty much the end of life right there. Except the sperm makes a highly specific enzyme that digests its way through the sticky stuff of the cumulus. What a stroke of luck, huh, for the evolutionists. Without this, it would have been over. You have to have the specific enzyme get through the cumulus. You're through the cumulus and you're down to the red layer. You see the red layer? That's a shell. You didn't know our human eggs had a shell, did you? Hey, it's not a hard shell like on a chicken. It's a kind of like a skim of jello, you know, a gelatinous, tough, jelly-like shell. And it's called the zona pellucida, which is a fancy name for clear zone. The sperm needs to get through that, except no way the sperm going to go through that, is it going to go through that clear zone. It's a barrier. But there's a second enzyme that specifically digests its way through the zona, without which there'd be no fertilization to the end of life. Now you're down to the membrane, and remember, we have two cells of completely different sources, one from father, one from the mother. They should have nothing to do with one another. In fact, they should build sort of resistant responses. But they don't. As soon as the first sperm cell, it might be just ever so slightly ahead of the next one, like a horse race, as soon as it touches the membrane of the egg, there's a quick little system that makes sure that it's the same species and all that sort of thing. And if everything is right, the membrane of the sperm and the membrane of the egg open up so that the contents of the sperm goes inside the egg. And that's the first step in fertilization. Remember, you have to keep the second one out. How do you do that? Oh, this is so wonderful that I'm not sure you're going to be able to contain yourself when I tell you this. Just under the surface of the egg cell membrane are a whole bunch of little granules called cortical granules that are right near the membrane, and they're full of an enzyme called ovoperoxidase. And as soon as that sperm touches the egg cell membrane, in just a fraction of a second, the granules explode, send their contents out into the space where the red shell is, and harden the shell. Any sperm not right at the membrane get locked right where they're at. What sort of a creator do we have? What are his limits? Once that happens, once fertilization happens, once the genetic material of the egg and the sperm are together, from that moment on, if you do not interfere, if you let it be, if you let God look on and watch and monitor the process in the womb, if he so wishes to bless you, a baby will be born 9 months later. And I believe it's from this moment on we ought not to interfere. It's the first chance that we, with our limited human minds, can perceive that there's something here that is forming a person known to God because God said he knew him even before the fertilization occurred. He certainly knows him now, or her, and watches on. Psalm 51 is sobering because not only does a person begin then, but like all persons on this earth, a person's a sinner. A fertilized egg is a sinner. Well, how about that for a definition of a person? Look in Psalm 51, verse 5 and 6. Behold, in other words, the psalmist wants to get your attention. This is important. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity. That means coming out of the womb. I was a sinner. Now, as the baby emerges, he was a sinner. But he goes further than that. And in sin my mother conceived me. That's the fertilization event. That's from the very beginning when life of the individual began and the person began. So we are sinful from the beginning. Behold, you desire truth in the inward parts, that is in the heart. And in the hidden part, you will make me know wisdom. Since we are a sinner and we're just a sinner from the beginning, we pray to God as the psalmist did in Psalm 51. To me, verse 10 and 11 here are simply one of the most important verses in the Bible. We spend a lot of time talking about creation. But the creation of heaven and earth is not the really big creation. The creation of heaven and earth, even when God says, oh, and he made the stars also as though it were, oh, there's something else. Oh, yes, all the stars. By the word, by speaking the word, there is a more phenomenal creation. There is a greater creation than that. And here it is. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence. Do not take your Holy Spirit from me. See, when God created the stars, he didn't have to argue with them. They didn't put up a fuss. They didn't say, we'll get together next week, we'll discuss this again. Adam and Eve didn't put up a fuss. He spoke, and it was. But when man fell into sin, he's got this stony heart. The Bible says he's at enmity. He's at warfare with God. And God needs to come in and create a new heart. I call that the second creation. And the third creation is he's gone to prepare a place for us. Well, back to our oviduct. We get out here to 30 hours after ovulation. We now have 2 cells. It's divided. We're on our way. Remember, every time you divide, 2, 4, 8, wow, you pick up cells in a big hurry, don't you, doing that, exponential growth. This is what the 2 cells look like. In a human, the egg is just divided, fertilized egg, and it's the first 2 cells made. And if you look, you can see the shell, the zona pellucida, going around it. Now, when you get into the adult or later in development, the cells are all held together by little buttons called desmosomes that kind of keep them from falling off and getting lost. There are little glues and buttons that hold them all together. But at this stage of development, there's really nothing holding the cells together except the shell. If the shell is defective and breaks down, those 2 cells can separate. Now, this is so heavy duty, you may want to plug your ears and not hear this because you're probably going to worry about it. But I've learned to just get blown over by God and just say, Lord, you know. I don't have to know. If they separate, you get 2 people. And if they stay together, you get 1 person. Each of you in this room could have been 2 people. Maybe some of you are. You have any identical twins here? Because an identical twin is a virtual clone. I have people say, oh, if they make a clone, would it be a monster? Would it have a soul? I say, you've probably met a clone in your life once or twice. Really? Yeah, an identical twin. It's a clone. But when God makes a clone, it works. You see, because these aren't germ cells anymore. This is not an egg anymore. This is not a sperm. These are body cells, you might say at this point, albeit embryonic ones. And if they split 2, if they stay together 1, how do we explain that? We don't. We leave it up to God. He knew them from eternity anyway, so. Now, most twins are not this kind. Most twins are where instead of 1 egg ovulating, 2 or more ovulated, and then they got fertilized. Now, there you could have a male and a female, right? But here they're going to have to be the same sex. In fact, they'll have exactly the same genes. You think, man alive, they must move at the same time. No, they each have their own personalities. One could conceivably be saved and one not. In fact, if you want to really think about what little we know about genetics, identical twins have exactly the same DNA as far as we know, but they have different fingerprints. Where are they coming from? I'm mainly here to give you questions, not answers. Well, we move on. About 3 days, you got a ball of cells, which is given the scientific name of ball of cells, which of course we call a morula. And then by about 4 to 4.5 days, the ball is in the uterus. And at about 5 days, that little ball is going to implant. And we'll talk about that. So you start out 2 cells, 4 cells, and then a ball of cells. You just keep getting. Actually, it doesn't get bigger. It's like cutting up a pie. The pieces don't make the pie bigger. They just subdivide the pie. So at first, the cells really don't get bigger. But at 4.5 days, this cell, this ball of cells becomes hollow, and we call that hollow ball a blastocyst. Now, that's not to demean it as being less than human. It just has the scientific blastocyst. And it is like a cyst. And it's this blastocyst that's going to penetrate into the wall of the uterus that you see in red up there. It's like planting a seed in the field. At about 5.5 to 6 days, the implantation. This is after ovulation. That implantation occurs. This is a miracle you're looking at right here. There's no way on earth that blastocyst should implant in the uterus. First of all, it's a different person. It's a different tissue. It doesn't have the same antigens as the mother, no more than your son or daughter has exactly the same genes as you do and the same antigens. If you take tissue from your son or daughter and inject it in your body, you will build an immune response against your own children, against their tissue. And yet the uterus says, come on in. And it comes in and it's not rejected. It should be, but it's not. And if it were, that'd be the end of life. You'd never get another chance at that. That's irreducible complexity. This group of cells right here, that's the baby. You think, well, if that's the baby, what are these other cells that form the ring out here? Oh, are they interesting? The ones that form the ring are called the cytotrophoblast. I won't even bother you with this name, except it really gets interesting. The cytotrophoblast cells fuse together. So you got two cells, they fuse together, you get one cell with two nuclei. Then another one fuses, you get one cell with three nuclei, right? We call this a syncytium, so the name changes eventually to syncytial trophoblast. And it is these syncytial trophoblast cells that are implanting at about 6 days after ovulation that secrete a chemical called HCG, human chorionic gonadotrophin, and that's the chemical we use for determining whether somebody's pregnant or not. The little tests are looking for this HCG. So the earliest stage you could tell that somebody's pregnant would be about 6 days, right when the implantation is occurring. And these syncytial trophoblasts are the only cells that have the ability to penetrate and go into the uterus. Without these cells, it'd be the end. These are the cells that can penetrate through the uterine wall. In fact, these are the cells that are going to make the placenta. Now remember what these are? Syncytial trophoblasts, fused cells. The whole placenta, the whole surface of the placenta is one cell, about half the size of a basketball court. Biggest cell in the body. But it's really only about this big around. But it's folded and folded and folded and folded so that it gets all that surface into a little area. And it's all one cell, and it's seamless, and it separates mother's blood from baby's blood. But we're getting ahead of the story. Let's look at, there's the syncytium penetrating through the uterine wall. You see the little fingers going through. Here it's penetrated a little further, the blue and yellow up there, that's the baby part. Basically, the baby is told, would you mind waiting a little while? You see, because it isn't going to do any good to work on you at this time. We need to create a plug-in. It's like having a nice TV, but if you can't plug it in, it doesn't do anything. And by the way, when you plug a TV in, is it simple? Is it just 3 holes in the wall? Is that all it is? You take and plug into any 3 holes and the TV runs? No, there's a power plant hooked on the other end of that plug. And the power plant's more complicated than the TV set. And that's the way the placenta is. It's one of the most incredible organs in the body. There's nothing else quite like it. I call it super organ. When I taught my medical students, they all knew I was talking about the placenta when I said super organ. And you need to make this whole organ, or you can forget about the developing baby. It's a TV with no plug-in. Now, birds and reptiles, they're like battery operated. They have an egg with yolk in it, and so they just use up the energy that's in the yolk, whereas we need to be plugged in. Now, the red you see down there, that's mother's blood vessel. There's a lot of blood vessels in the uterus, and they're going to be brought into close association with the green, which is the developing placenta, the fused syncytial trophoblasts. We're getting close. There's a mother's blood vessel there. And when that syncytial trophoblast hits those arteries, one of the most incredible things you can think about happens. The ends of the arteries of the mother's uterus get eroded so that the arteries just end, like cutting off a hose. There's about 20 arteries big enough that you can see them, maybe half the diameter of a lead pencil or so. 20 truncated arteries. Wow, you better have a nice seal on this placenta or this blood, which comes through at the rate eventually of a half a quart a minute, is going to lead to some pretty serious complications. But we need to get mother's blood up there to bring nutrients and oxygen to the baby when we finally get around to working on baby. This syncytial trophoblast makes a lot of hollow cavities inside. You can see it in the green here. And the blood is going to eventually flow into those cavities. See the red blood flowing into the cavities in the green syncytial trophoblast. Finally, you're going to have little processes all around the baby. And the baby's going to make blood vessels of its own, and they're going to be on one side of that syncytial trophoblast, that seamless cell layer, and mother's blood's going to be on the other side, and they'll never mix because the barrier between them is seamless. Eventually, the placenta just becomes a flat disc, but early on here, for example, at 40 days of development, it goes all the way around, and if you'll notice, placenta is almost like hair. You see where the surface area is so big, you have all these little processes, each one of which has blood vessel inside from the baby, and then the outside of all this hairy processes is bathed by mother's blood. So there's a tremendous surface area for interchange. If you magnify just one of those little hair-like processes that are on the placenta, under the scanning electron microscope, you can see that these little processes have even tinier processes coming off from them, further increasing the surface area. So where you see black in this picture, that would be all solid mother's blood. The baby's blood vessels would be inside of those little finger-like processes, so the materials and nutrients have to go across to get to the baby. Let's cut a cross-section. See the red line? We're going to cut one of these little microscopic, tiny, tiny little processes and look at inside. If we look inside, there it is, the baby's blood vessels, but not the blood vessels of the baby's body so much as the blood vessels that are in the placenta. This is a little blood vessel, this is another one, this is another one. The red blood cells you see in here belong to the baby and were made by the baby. The red blood cells you see just out here are red blood cells of the mother, and between the two is this incredibly thin cell, which is that seamless syncytial trophoblast. The nuclei have the good discretion to get out of the way and move to the side to make very thin areas across which gas and nutrient exchange can occur. So everything going from mother's blood to baby's blood has to go across either passively or actively. For example, water could just go across passively. You don't need to pump it across. Sadly, alcohol will go across from mother's blood to baby's blood passively. So a mother who consumes alcohol will be giving the same dosage essentially to her baby, and a baby can be born with fetal alcohol syndrome. A mother who takes some of these recreational so-called drugs, sadly, many of these drugs go across the placental barrier passively. So you can have a baby born as a crack baby from crack cocaine. Oddly enough, most of the things that are really important to the baby have to be carried across with special molecules. For example, for the baby to make its own blood, it needs iron. The only way it can get iron is from the mother's blood, and the iron has to be transported across from the mother's side to the baby's side with special proteins, one of which is called transferrin, that can come over here, pick up the iron, carry it across, and release it on the baby side. What a miracle we have here, just in the placenta. This is kind of what the placenta looks like in the whole. You can see a couple of the arteries that are truncated in there, and they're just blasting the blood out, like going up to some bushes. All those little villi we were showing you sort of look like branches of a bush with blood vessels inside, and the blood just gets sprayed over them, and it's sealed so it can't leak out of the sides of the placenta. You'll notice that there are two veins coming into the placenta and a artery coming out of the placenta, and that exchanges the blood between the baby and the placenta. The placenta is then really part of the baby, not part of the mother. But it's really not in the baby's body. It's attached by a fairly long hose. And you have to make sure you don't kink the hose. You know, ask any mother, that's, she'll tell you when the baby is in the womb, they do loop-to-loops, and they do wing-overs, they do all these things. They do all this. How are you going to do that without kinking the tube? This is so gorgeous. There's a special jelly, not found anywhere else in the body, Wharton's jelly. The blood vessels are in there, and when you bend it, it resists kinking the blood vessels. Evolutionists say, what an incredible stroke of luck. Now, the most amazing thing I'm going to tell you all day is that when the baby's born, this placenta comes out, first the baby comes out, and then the placenta comes out as afterbirth, along with other membranes. And when that placenta unplugs, approximately 20 good-size arteries, virtually truncated at their ends, are now open to the lumen of the uterus to spray blood at approximately a half quart per minute. You think this is bad? You haven't heard the whole story yet. There is a mechanism in the placenta that suppresses blood clotting. Now, to get the picture, a hemophiliac, right, one that can't clot his blood, with 20 severed arteries, releasing blood at a little over a half a quart a minute. Anybody see a problem here? How on earth does anyone survive this? People have said this is the biggest wound any human being gets and lives to tell a story. Biggest wound. How bleeding to death is prevented is so amazing. When the blood vessel breaks apart, part goes with the placenta, part stays with the uterus. There's a little muscular sphincter, like a string on a purse, that, fortunately is on the side of the break towards the uterus, that squeezes suddenly and pinches off the blood, just sort of like a surgeon would use a hemostat to pinch a blood vessel. It all closes down so that under normal delivery you may lose a small cup of blood or something like that. Is this not amazing? Absolutely incredible. Flat out miracle. And yet people look at it and say, I don't see any design here. There's no design. What do you think? We give them a better example? We're not going to give them a better example. If they say, I don't see any design here, forget about it. You're not going to change that mind with scientific arguments. The only thing that can change that mind is the power of the Word of God and the Holy Spirit. That's the only thing that can do it. And lest you think it's not up to the task, it was nothing more than the Word that spoke the very universe into existence. Can that Word and the Holy Spirit change your hearts? Yeah, it can. It really can. Well, 4-week embryo, kind of interesting. Here he is in there, human embryo. Got the little yolk sac. The yolk sac, by the way, doesn't really make yolk. Blood vessels are developed in there in the earliest stages of blood formation. Let's get it out of the way. Evolutionists get really excited about these 4-week embryos. They say, look, it's got paddles. This is the fish stage. Oh, look, gills. I had a teacher, my daughter had a teacher in public school that said the baby uses the gills to breathe under the amniotic fluid. Wow. You can see the heart protruding there. The body's bent like a C because the nervous system grows faster than the rest of the body at first. And because it grows faster, it gets out ahead of the body. Notice the spinal cord has gone beyond the end of the body. That's because it's growing faster. If you look here, you see on the back, get my pointer up here, the spinal cord was growing so fast it got way out here and the body hasn't even kept up. There's those so-called gill slits. I can tell you two things about the gill slits that are absolutely true. You can bank on it. Number one, they are not gills. Number two, they're not slits. Do you get the idea? There are no gill slits. Now, what about that? Evolutionists look at that and say, there you go. There's your evidence for evolution. That's the tail stage. We have a tail. Well, as the baby grows, the body starts catching up, and what you see here protruding beyond the body ends up ending right about here in the smaller, just below the small of your back. That's where your spinal cord ends. And so then the body gets ahead of the spinal cord. It's not a tail. There's some little bones that develop down there at the end, and of course the spinal column has to end someplace, right? It is a linear structure, and there's a head on one end, and wherever the other end ends, there standing by will be an evolutionist pointing, saying, see, a tail. But how can you avoid having the other end? I tried this with a rope once. I had two ends, I cut off one end. Every time I cut off an end, I still had two ends. So Ernst Haeckel, back at the time of Darwin, talked about these gill slits being reminiscent of our evolutionary development, said the embryos in their development went through all the stages of their evolution, or at least many of them, and he showed how similar the chicken and the dog and the pig and the human were. But it turns out that these drawings he made were completely falsified. It was a hoax. The man was a charlatan, essentially. It's not like that at all. And yet, years ago, Dr. Spock, remember him? You couldn't have a baby without reading Dr. Spock. It was considered the handbook for babies, or the manual. And Dr. Spock, in his book, Baby and Child Care, says each child as he develops is retracing the whole history of mankind, physically and spiritually, step by step. A baby starts off in the womb as a single tiny cell, just the way the first living thing appeared in the ocean. Weeks later, as he lies in the amniotic fluid of the womb, he has gills like a fish. Notice he even says we're retracing spiritually our evolutionary history. Well, this just simply isn't true. This has been known to be untrue for a long time. Here's a paper that was in a journal some time ago, and they pointed out that Haeckel's embryos are just simply a fraud. That if you look at the real, compare the real embryos, they're not similar at all between the different animals. I mean, they have general overall similarities, but they're fundamental differences that he did not show. In fact, many evolutionists have said the same thing. This whole embryology, this recapitulation business, that our embryo, when it develops, kind of reminisces on our evolutionary history, that is just simply not true. Paul Ehrlich, you've probably heard of him, he says this interpretation of embryological sequences just won't stand close examination. Its shortcomings have been almost universally pointed out by modern authors, but the idea still has a prominent place in biological mythology. And where would you go for biological mythology today? I suggest any high school biology textbook or college, for example. Biology Principles and Explorations by Holt and Reinhardt, a widely used textbook. There they are. The whole recapitulation myth, as we call it today, it is a myth. Lined up in a row, showing you how the embryos retrace their evolutionary history. Want another book? This is McGraw-Hill's text. Same thing. Evidence from embryos. See our evolutionary ancestry. It just goes on and on. What are those little folds anyway? Well, they have nothing to do with gills and respiration. Those folds we see in the neck go on in the embryo to develop into a number of different organs, and you see some of them illustrated here. The ear canal, some of the bones of the middle ear, the eustachian tubes, the thyroids, the parathyroids. There are a number of structures. Notice none of them have anything to do with respiration. They are completely separate structures. They are not gills. Well, back to our little embryo, we need to just jump ahead now to the end of the story, because embryology is so complicated, I couldn't talk about any specific example, not the heart, not the liver, anything. So let's just jump ahead. There we are. The baby's in the womb, ready to come out. Oh, praise the Lord, he's got the head down, not the rump. You can see the umbilical cord there, no kinks. Oh, we got a problem. I wish we would have thought about this. Have you heard about the fellow that built a boat in the basement of his house and then discovered he couldn't get it out of the door? Don't you just hate it when that happens? Look at the incredible sequence of miracles we've had to do to get to this point, and if I got sad news for you. No way are you getting the baby out of that womb because the opening isn't big enough. You see a problem here? And I'm not just talking about dilation of the soft tissue. You can't get let's look at a lady's pelvis. It's very different than a male pelvis. Lady's pelvis is more open. A male pelvis is more like a funnel. And the head would be right down there in that opening you see at the center. You see the so-called tailbone in the background, the coccyx, which evolutionists say, hey, there you go, that's the tail. Has no function except to remind us of our tailed evolutionary ancestry. Nothing could be further from the truth, as I will show. You see, the baby's head isn't going to fit through that bony circle. What do you plan on doing about that? Miracle. Just nothing but a miracle. There are three seams. Let me point them out to you up here. There's a seam right here. This is a good old sacroiliac, the sacrum and the iliac bone. And there is a kind of a tight seam between these two bones here. There's another one just like it on this side. And finally, there's a seam at the front. So three seams that hold the three bones of the pelvis, this one, and this one, kind of together in a ring. And this seam has a little bit of a give to it. That's why when you jump off a high building and land on your feet, there's just enough give there so you don't break the bones of the pelvis. Isn't that nice? But for the baby's head to fit through, special enzymes, collagenase, must partially digest the ligaments that hold these bones together. And then they open up just a little bit. And now if you turn the baby's head just right, it has to be turned like a key in a lock, it just fits. By the way, that little bone down there is the busiest bone in the body. See the tailbone evolution? I even heard an obstetrician say why that bone has no function other than to remind us of our evolutionary ancestry. If you rank ordered how important bones were by how many muscles are attached from how many different directions, this would be the winner. How many of you have fallen on your tailbone? Boy, does that hurt or what? 3 positions you can't stand to be in: standing, sitting, and lying down. Those 3, you can't deal with it. The reason is if you look down on that pelvis, all of these muscles that form the floor of our pelvic diaphragm come in from all directions and anchor to that one little bone that I prefer to call the coccyx, not the tailbone. It makes the whole floor down here. Without this, wow, whoopee, all the materials of our body would have an open pathway down. And the baby has to go through there and not only has to stretch out this orifice right here, but even when it stretches it maximally, the bony rim won't let the head through unless the ligaments loosen up and open up. My goodness, the birth of every baby is just quite simply a miracle. And when the baby comes out, the problems aren't over. At first, its blood supply is all wrong because, you see, the placenta has served as a kidney. A baby can be born without kidneys. A placenta is a lung. A baby can be born without lungs. The placenta is the intestinal tract. It doesn't need an intestinal tract until it's born. The placenta is the liver. The placenta is a large part of the endocrine system. The placenta does everything. It is super organ. And when the baby's born and it's disconnected from the placenta, it better have all these organs ready to go for the first time, or it'll die. And what do we do with the placenta when the baby's born? Into the OR can. We just throw it away. Would you at least give a prayer to God and thanks for that placenta? What an incredible, selfless organ. It does its job and it vanishes. It's so friable that it breaks down. You can't even hardly take it in to show it to a medical student unless you run from the delivery room to the lecture room very quickly and say, look, quick. And when that baby's born, the blood vessels have been bypassing certain organs. Because you haven't needed the liver, the blood vessels have actually bypassed the liver. And because the lungs are developing, most of the blood supply bypasses the lungs. Takes a shortcut over to the aorta. But boy, when the baby's born, you better get the plumbing put back the way it's supposed to be. And what happens is a very sudden constriction of that blood vessel that was bypassing most of the blood away from the lungs. Now it closes down, and for the first time when the baby's born, all that blood from the right ventricle of the heart goes into the lungs. And down here in the liver, you were bypassing the liver, and the little bypass is closed down, and now for the first time you're taking blood from the intestinal tract and running it through the liver because the placenta was doing all that before. And all this has to happen just as soon as the baby comes out. You don't have a whole lot of time to grow something new. Now, if the baby comes out a little early, 2 months premature, as my grandson did here, the lungs may not be fully developed. And the problem is that the lungs, if you think of a sandwich bag, a plastic sandwich bag, have a little water in it, doesn't the side kind of cling? Ever take 2 plates of glass with a drop of water and put them together, you can't even pull them apart? That's because the surface tension forces are measured in tons per square inch. And the water inside of the lung, which is necessary, locks the lungs up just like 2 wet pieces of glass stuck together. You can't get any air in, you can't open it up. Because a baby at this stage hasn't gotten around to making a special surfactant that's a detergent that breaks down the surface tension forces that allows the lungs to open up yet. And there are ways, thank the Lord, that we can deal with that, and we did with my grandson, but it was very troublesome. You know, he was 7 to 8 months here of age. That happens to be the age of John the Baptist, about 7 to 8 months, when he first met Jesus. 7 to 8 months in the womb. not out of the womb. 7 to 8 months of development in the womb was the age of John the Baptist in the womb of Elizabeth. And it says in Luke, "For indeed, as soon as the voice of your greeting sounded in my ears," this is in the presence of Jesus, who was several months less developed, "the babe leaped in my womb for joy." I have a question I want you to think about the rest of the day. What was the nature of the joy? Maybe the Bible is just speaking in a figurative way here. Mothers feel the baby quicken or move in the womb. No, God's word said, John the Baptist, the age of the baby you just saw, only still in the womb, leaped for joy in the presence of his Savior. Oh, there are things going on here that are way too complex for me. Now, we were born once, and it was an amazing process. But there's another birth process more amazing than what you've seen, and that's called being born a second time, being born again. And when Jesus told people that they must be born again, we get the comment of Nicodemus. How can a man be born when he's old? Can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? No. That would be the easy way. Even I can sort of, in my wild imagination, imagine getting back in the womb again. But this born again is not going into the womb again. This is taking our condition of being dead in trespasses and sin and being turned around and sent off in a whole new direction, so contrary to the very nature of man. Greatest miracle of all. And I pray that all of us in this room have experienced that wonderful miracle. And I thank you.